Hello all, myself Divya. Today's topic for discussion is government budget. Here we start the lesson with the introduction of budget, objectives behind budget, components of budget, and the last part will be talking about different type of deficit and the preventive measures taken so far to reduce down the deficit or public debt. What government budget is? This can be understood taking the example of personal budget. In personal budget, we are keeping a track on revenue and expenditure part. Just like that, government budget deals with government revenue and government expenditure. Second most important thing which have to be kept in mind is central government budget is different from state government budget. So if Nirmala Sitharaman, who is Union Finance Minister or Central Finance Minister, is reading out budget, this will be applicable to the entire nation. Whereas if Maharashtra state government come with a budget, it will only be applicable in the state of Maharashtra and nowhere else. A government budget is an annual financial statement wherein we are talking about the estimates of expected revenue and anticipated expenditure. So here you can understand that every year government have to come up with the budget. This is expected revenue and anticipated expenditure. So there can be some here and there in the revenue and expenditure part. Next, who makes government budget? We have Ministry of Finance under which there are so many divisions. So budget division is charged with the responsibility of making budget. They consider all the available resources, needs of different sectors and accordingly chart out budget, which is presented by Finance Minister. Why government need to come up with the budget? The very simple logic behind this is every government is charged with some economic, social, and political responsibilities. Government budget can be proved as a weapon to establish and implement policies to achieve economic, social, and political objectives. Now we discuss objectives behind government budget. These are the broad objectives which remain same for every country when they are framing government budget. The first is allocation of resources. Allocation of resources can be simply understood as disbursement of fund to the different segments and sectors of economy. So if government feel agricultural sector is not doing good job, they are going to allocate and give more money to the agricultural sector in comparison to others who are doing good job. Next is reduction of poverty and inequality. So here government have planned progressive taxation wherein they are going to tax people according to their level of income, and by collecting that money they are going to distribute this in the form of social securities and subsidies to those people who have lack of access to education system, foods and health facilities. Next is economic growth and stability. This have to be foremost aim and objective behind the preparation of government budget. Government have to make sure that their policies is going in line with the economic growth and development. So my growth must be quantitative as well as qualitative in its aspect. So here government have to keep in mind the economic and social well-being. Next is economic stability. Economic fluctuation can be in the form of high rate of unemployment, recession, or lack of demand. In this case, government have to come into the picture and rescue the economy. So in the case of lack of demand, government have to pump in more money so that it generates more demand, which in turn generates more employment and income in the hand of people, which is going to take economy to a stable point. The last one is employment generation. Government is going to focus more on those sectors which have capability of absorbing more labor force. Labor abundant country like India focuses more on the MSME sector, that is micro, small and medium enterprise, agriculture and allied activities which have capability to absorb more labor and generate more employment. How we are going to do this? That is purely the work of committees who are working in the framing of budget and fiscal policies. Let's talk about the type of budget. The first is zero based and traditional budgeting. Zero based budgeting is a type of budget where we are starting from the scratch, whereas traditional budgeting is a type of budget where we are taking into consideration the previous fund allotment. So, for example, if we are given work of allotting fund to service sector and we have to follow the zero based budgeting, we will not look into the previous fund allotment. But if we are following traditional budgeting, then we surely have to take a look into the previous fund allotment done to the service sector and accordingly decide the fund disbursement to that sector. Next is performance budgeting. Under performance budgeting, we are end result oriented of a particular program, scheme, or activity. This kind of budgeting involved a very detailed and objective analysis. The budget process, hence, is very result oriented in its approach. Ministries who are involved in developmental activities opt for performance budgeting. Next is program budget. This is similar to the performance budgeting. Here, funds are allocated according to the achievements expected from each program over a specific period. Here, more emphasis is laid on the size of program, implementation cost, and the benefit expected out of each program. One thing which makes both of them different is program budgeting is narrower than performance budgeting. Next is multiple and unified budgeting. Here, to understand this, we'll take the example of India. Earlier, India was following multiple budget wherein they were having different budget for railway and different budget for the general category. But now we follow unified budget wherein we have a single budget which includes receipts from all sources and outflows for all the programs of the government. Majority of the country follow unified budget. Next is legislative and executive budget. Here, under the legislative budget, we have legislatures. They are basically lawmakers who are working with a committee which consists of people having specialized knowledge. All this are making and coming up with a target of growth rate or a broad idea of what economy should look after 1 year. After decisions have been taken, we go to the other step, that is executive part. So the executive budget looks on the implementation. For example, if legislature have decided that growth rate of service sector should be 4%, now this is the duty of executive wing of the government to decide how we are going to achieve that 4% growth rate. Next is revenue and capital budget. Revenue budget talks about the revenue aspect, whereas capital budget is more concerned with that aspect which acquire and dispose capital assets. Let's talk about the revenue and capital budget in a detailed manner. Now we'll be talking about the component of Indian budget. This is how government budget looks like. Government budget can be divided into revenue budget and capital budget. Revenue budget can be further divided into receipts and expenditure. Similarly, capital budget can be divided into receipts and expenditure. Revenue receipts is further divided into tax receipts and non-tax receipts. Revenue and capital expenditure both are divided into plan expenditure and non-expenditure. Let's look into the revenue budget. We know that revenue budget consists of two things, revenue receipts and revenue expenditure. Let's talk about revenue receipts. Revenue receipts is broadly focusing on those areas from where government is generating money. So the first is tax revenue. We pay two kinds of tax, that is direct and indirect tax. Both the tax becomes revenue for the government. Next is non-tax revenue. Here we'll not be discussing all kind of non-tax revenue, but the major source of non-tax revenue for the government. Fees. The money which we are paying for availing goods and services which is being provided by the government becomes revenue for the government. Penalties and fines which we are paying for breaking social and economic norms. Next is profit from public sector enterprise. Public sector enterprise can be simply understood as enterprise or a company owned by government or public sector. Example could be BSNL, MTNL. Whatever profits have been made by BSNL or MTNL will go into the pocket of government. Gifts and grants. This could be in the form of money or immovable assets. So in whichever form government receive this become receipts for the government. Next is revenue expenditure. Here we'll not be talking about all kind of expenditure which government is incurring, but the areas wherein government is making huge expenditure. The first is interest payment. We all know the government or the public debt is a very well known problem that every economy is facing. So the majority of the money goes into the interest payment. The next is major subsidies. Under major subsidies, we have subsidies on food, subsidies on petroleum, and the last one is subsidies on fertilizer. Defense expenditure also needs to be taken care of. Irrespective of the money we are pumping into defense, we have to make sure that a border is safe. So here you can see indirect tax examples. Now we shift our attention to capital budget. Capital budget is also consists of two parts: capital receipts and capital expenditure. Capital receipts consist of recovery of loan. Many a times government also give loan to third party. Disinvestment. Disinvestment can be simply understood as selling up of public enterprise or public sector units. Whenever government does this, they are making money which will be counted under capital receipts. Borrowing. Whenever government borrow money, this is adding to the capital or the money which government have. Then we have other liabilities like provident fund. So whatever money have been collected under provident fund becomes the part of capital receipts of government budget. Then we have capital expenditure. So here government is making expenditure, but this is a developmental expenditure unlike the revenue expenditure which was not developmental. Example could be building up schools, hospitals, building bridges, building dams, and buying up of machinery and equipments will also be considered as a part of capital expenditure. Now we move to type of deficit. Before jumping to the type of deficit, we must understand what deficit is. When I say deficit, there is a shortage of something. Here, there is a shortage of revenue or money. Mismatch between revenue and expenditure needs to be fulfilled. How government fills this? That is purely call of government. The first is revenue deficit. Revenue deficit only talks about the revenue budget, which says that how much more we have incurred expenditure considering the receipts. So revenue deficit is revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts. Next is budgetary deficit. Budgetary deficits gives us overall picture. So here we are taking into consideration total expenditure and total receipts. Total expenditure consists of revenue expenditure as well as capital expenditure. Whereas total receipt also consists of revenue receipts and capital receipts. Next is fiscal deficit. Every year, whenever government is announcing budget, they have to come up with the fiscal deficit target. Right now, it is 3.8% of GDP. So, the formula is total expenditure minus total receipts, except borrowing, which is missing from the bracket. So, please consider this. Fiscal deficit equals total expenditure minus total receipts. Under bracket, we are excluding the borrowing part, the amount which government have borrowed from the third party. Fiscal deficit is the most comprehensive measurement of budgetary imbalance. Fiscal deficit could be financed by borrowing both internally, that is within the country, and externally, outside the country. Next is primary deficit. Primary deficit is simply splitting the fiscal deficit in two parts, that is interest payment and primary deficit. Here, this is giving us clear picture because we have studied this in earlier part under capital expenditure, that interest payment is a huge expenditure on the part of government. So if we exclude that, we are going to get what is the exact picture of deficit for the government. Next is effective revenue deficit. This is the new concept. Here we have added one new word before the revenue deficit, that is effective revenue deficit. So the only thing we are doing here is we are excluding those grants which have been used for the creation of capital asset. Because it have created assets, we are trying to exclude this from the deficit part, because in reality that is not the deficit, but it may look so. So far we have studied about type of deficit. So with the help of this chart given, we will try calculating different type of deficit. So for example, if you want to calculate primary deficit, you must know the formula. So we start with a very simple formula, that is of primary deficit. So primary deficit is simply fiscal deficit minus interest payment. So you can see here primary deficit is on 17th number. The formula is fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit is on 16th. Yes, it is. Then you can see where interest payment is. Interest payment is on 11th number. So yes, the formula is correct. Primary deficit is 16 minus 11. 16 represent fiscal deficit and 11 represent interest payment. So this is how we derive at different kind of deficit. Next, how to solve this problem? So to make a strong rule, government came up with an act which is known as Frbm Act of 2003. Frbm is Fiscal Responsibility Budgetary Management Act. So the main purpose of coming up with this act is to reduce the debt burden on the part of government and to lead government towards sustainable debt management regime. Let us study about the objectives. The first is making the process of budgeting transparent. Here now government have to be very transparent about the revenue sources and the expenditure, and they also have to justify why they are incurring so much expenditure on a particular sector. Next is ensuring equitable distribution of debt. So this act makes sure that we are not piling up debt in a particular year. By putting a limit on the fiscal deficit, we are saying that yes, we are allowed to face deficit or to have the gap between revenue expenditure, but to certain extent. The last one is ensuring fiscal stability in the long run. So if we are going to follow the long term fiscal debt management regime, for sure in the long run we will have a very healthy economy. This objective lead us to the target. So these are the targets which have been mentioned under Frbm Act, which says revenue deficit must be reduced annually 0.5% of GDP. That is minimum. Okay, so here we are saying that is the limit minimum. At least you have to do that. If you can do more reduction than zero point 0.5, that is cherry on the cake. The second is fiscal deficit, which has to be brought down annually by 0.3% of GDP. Then we have total debt, which has to be reduced 1% of GDP. And the last one talks about seizing or stopping RBI for the purchase of government bond from the government. So here we are creating autonomy on the part of RBI. Now RBI is no more working under the government and they are no more obliged to make purchase of treasury bills or government bonds under pressure. Hope everything is clear.